just realized that initially the way that we had placed these pictures was not right, and I wanted to have people pay attention to them and me pay attention to them. So you'll understand that you guys really should be looking at these two verses, and conversely, you should really be looking at these verses. So you can pay attention to it if you want.
I can't even read them from here.
Okay. Can this be heard? All right, guys, so this week we are wrapping up James chapter 4. So I figure we can just read the whole thing instead of just the verses that I'll be working on. So let's start at the beginning of James chapter 4 to give us our whole thought here. What is causing the quarrels and fights among you? Don't they come from the evil desires at war within you? You want what you don't have, so you scheme and kill to get it. You are jealous of what others have, but you can't get it. So you fight and wage war to take it away from them. Yet you don't have what you want because you don't ask God for it. And even when you ask, you don't get it because your motives are all wrong. You want only what will give you pleasure. You adulterers, don't you realize that friendship with the world makes you an enemy of God? I say it again, if you want to be a friend of the world, you make yourself an enemy of God. What do you think the Scriptures mean when they say that the Spirit God has placed within us is filled with envy? But He gives us even more grace to stand against such evil desires. As the Scriptures say, God opposes the proud, but favors the humble. So humble yourselves before God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Come close to God, and God will come close to you. Wash your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, for your loyalty is divided between God and the world. Let there be tears for what you have done. Let there be sorrow and deep grief. Let there be sadness instead of laughter and gloom instead of joy. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and He will lift you up in honor. Don't speak evil against each other, dear brothers and sisters. If you criticize and judge each other, then you are criticizing and judging God's law. But your job is to obey the law, not to judge whether it applies to you. God alone, who gave the law, is the judge. He alone has the power to save or to destroy. So what right do you have to judge your neighbor? Look here, you who say, today or tomorrow we are going to a certain town and will stay there a year. We will do business there and make a profit. How do you know what your life will be like tomorrow? Your life is like the morning fog. It's there a little while and then it's gone. What you ought to say is, if the Lord wants us to, we will live and do this or that. Otherwise, you are boasting about your own plans, and all such boasting is evil. Remember, it is sin to know what you ought to do and then not do it. So I would wager most of your guys' versions of the Bible have this broken up into its own little separate, nice little paragraph, as if it's its own separate thought. Am I right? Do all you guys have your things separated? Mine does too. This shouldn't be seen as a separate thought. It should be seen as a continuation, actually, to my previous sermon about humble living and humility. In this particular passage, 13 through 17, James is referring to certain individuals and their, I guess, business practices about what they were doing. But it's an issue, especially today, it's an issue that opens up the doorway to something much bigger. It's like this indulgence in self-reliance on what we can do, and how that manifests itself into just earthly wisdom again. And when we follow our own selfish ambition instead of striving to align ourselves with God and what His will is and what we can be doing in that process, we open up ourselves. James says it's evil. So we find ourselves, like Josh was saying or explaining last week, we find ourselves on the wrong side of that war, I guess. James calls it evil, and even more so for us as believers when we ought to know better. He calls it sin. So we're not talking about like little things, like little daily things, like what am I going to eat, or what am I going to wear, or how will I do this or that. That's not what James is referring to. James is talking about man's, bigger thinking, like bigger plans without recognition of God's will. And that plays out, I would say that plays out even bigger today than maybe it did back then. And it's a mentality thing in today's world. From the get-go, like as we're growing up, we are like given this formula, I guess. Like, you go to school and then you graduate and get your degree, you get your job, you get married, you have kids, so on and so forth. And so we're encouraged at a young age to have a formulated idea of what we want for our lives and how we are going to achieve those things. And there's an emphasis on you and your control of that and what you're going to do to get that and get to that point. Yeah, we're told even that our lives are in our hands. You can do whatever you want. Believe in yourself. That kind of thing. Believe in your own ability, and so people use that to shape what they do. I'm good at this, so this is where my future lies. I'm so on and so forth. But that's not what godly wisdom is. If we look back into Romans chapter 12, Paul's talking about living for God. He says, starting at verse 2, don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. And he goes on to talk about how we should be using our gifts to, lift up the body and help the body. So it's a mentality thing, and it's huge. It's a huge reliance on self in today's society, and we're even told it's like one of those lines that people are sensitive to. Like if you tell them that you're going to rely on God or ask, seek God and what it is that He would have you do, it's like you're kind of looked at like you're crazy, and it's sort of a hard thing for people to stomach, if they don't have a relationship with God and they look at you dumbfounded. But that's what James is asking us to do. He's asking us to put ourselves before God and look for guidance from Him in all that we do. And we see it also play out in finances. And I know that this is it's a hard one to deal with, but again, we see it in finances, the way that we try to control our finances to set up our future. You have things like 401k programs and savings accounts and all these different things to help you in your future. So that you're in control of your future, and whatnot. And so it's your own future is not escaping your hands or whatever. So I'm not saying that is necessarily bad, but I do have to ask the question, and I think we should be asking the questions of where those things came from. There's obviously a shift in mentality over time, relying on God rather than relying on ourselves. So finances is very big. Going back to Scripture again, if we look in the book of Luke, when Christ is talking about the rich man, we can read it, but I know it. So Christ is talking about the rich man and this man's plans to do things to help his cause, he talks about building a barn to store all these things and whatnot, and but God says to him, you're a fool for doing this. You're a fool for trying to control these things. He tells him he's going to die tonight. So, yeah, godly wisdom doesn't look like that. It doesn't look like trying to control too much. It seeks God's will and everything that we do. Pastor Monty just today at the end of his praise and prayer, and even James said it too. Like, they're talking and they're giving credit to God, and we should be seeking His will in the things that we're doing, and that's true. And I was definitely thinking about that while they were doing their praise. Yeah, and then so again, as I was saying, verse 14 in James is talking about life and how we aren't in control of it. Anything can happen, you can die tomorrow or whatever, like tragedy can come or whatever, God can teach you a lesson. And I believe that if we do have that mentality, we're asking for God to teach us a lesson, like we're asking for it to be taken away from us because we're not seeking His will in what we're doing. We're seeking like control of our own lives and whatnot. So I think finances is a huge topic for that, and I think that it's something that man struggles with, and I think we have to be aware of that. Yeah, as men specifically, we struggle with this idea of trying to control too much of our own future. We're like very goal-oriented people, and so we think in those terms of goals to reach. And we don't really seek God in those things. Forgive me for picking on you, Alex, but I said that it reminded me of the scripture when we were having a conversation the other night. But right now, Alex is in like a huge point of his life where he's got a lot of things that he wants to do and he needs to do, and he sees God working in his life. But it's really easy, and I can relate to Alex, but it's really easy to be focused on yourself during this process, like I have to do this, and then I have to do this, and then this will happen, and then this will happen, and so on and so forth. I forget who, it's probably all of us, but we were reminding Alex that he, should calm down. Don't be overwhelmed by these things. Seek God and ask for God's help in these things, and allow Him to lead you, and trust that certain things will fall into place when you are following following Him. So I was definitely reminded of that conversation with Alex, and as men we struggle with that. Yeah, just this weekend, or this week rather, Colin and I have very clear ideas as throughout our week of when we can do stuff for Eldership Academy or work on things, prepare a sermon. So I was, over the course of this week, I was getting really stressed out about the lack of time, because I have these plans if I'm going to work on this and then this and then this. But I was getting really stressed out over the course of the week because different needs pop up and you have to take care of those things. And by yesterday, I was still not where I wanted to be in my sermon and planning it. And I asked on one of our eldership threads, if I'm needed here, at the church yesterday for everything we were doing. And yeah, that was a humbling experience for me, and it was definitely, it was weird because I'm reading this scripture, yet I'm going through the process at the same time, so it was really hard for me. But Josh told me you need to trust, and even just now he said you need to trust that God will give you the things that you need to say, and you need to trust that He'll lead you. And this won't be the first time this happens. We, especially in this church, we run at such a fast pace of doing things. There will be time and time again where you don't get to do the things you need to do or want to do, but you need to trust in God and that He will take care of you and use you how He would use you. So just even up until yesterday, it was something that I struggled with and that I had to be humbled in. But yeah, am I saying that we shouldn't make plans or set goals? Not saying that. Scripture is really clear about people being lazy and the consequences of being lazy. You know, I could shout off, I have listed, but there's multiple instances in Proverbs especially about what happens to the lazy person, you know, and whatnot. And even in Romans 15, you see Paul himself. I mean, it's even really similar to what these guys are doing. You see Paul himself talking to the people and telling them, I'm going to do this, this, and this, and I'm going to go to this city and then this city. And so you see Paul listing out these plans, very similar to the way in which you see here in James, but the difference is Paul, and he's kind of known for this in his letters, but Paul has a clear understanding that he is submitting to God's will in all these things. And you see him even saying the words, if the Lord wills, then I will be here for you guys, or I'll be here for you guys. And so that's the sort of mentality that we need to be adopting if we're to have godly wisdom. I'm also reminded of James Pierzina struggle with his IRS situation. He hates being there. I don't know if you'd say you hate being there. You don't like being there. But James is clear that it's clear to James, that God has something else that he wants James to be doing with that. What that is, James doesn't know and we don't know, but James is in submission to God's will in that, and he has a clear understanding of that, and that's what we need to be able to recognize too. Like, we make plans for things or whatever. If they don't come to fruition or whatever, we need to be able to have the maturity, and that's a lot of what we're talking about. We need to be able to have the maturity to recognize when it's not in God's will at this time or that time, or if it is, then it's something that plays out in a way which we would never have expected. James has felt like this burden that he has there, and he feels like he hasn't accomplished it, or he questions why he's still there. But like, we have Wendy and her family, and then everyone that comes from Wendy, so we need to be able to be mature in our thinking, I guess, is just what I'm saying, and be willing to humble ourselves in that process, like God's will, it trumps our will, and that's what I'm saying. So I'm not saying we shouldn't make plans. I'm saying that the precursor should always be if the Lord wills, as Paul said, and we need to be able to roll with that. And when you are making plans, they should go through different filters, in your planning of your future or whatever. Who are you glorifying? Are you seeking to further yourself, or are you seeking to glorify God in everything that you do? Are you trying to take credit for all those things you do, or is there some recognition somewhere along the way of God working in your life to get you to that point? I know that Pastor Monty and I have had a couple of conversations just in the past about that alone, and it's a hard one, like people that go through crappy things in their life, and they work to get out of that, and then they get to this point, and they should be commended for that, but there needs to be a recognition of God in that process, God helped you along the way. I'm not saying that you don't believe that, for the record. I'm just using that as an example. But yeah, there needs to be filters for these plans that we have. I said, are you glorifying God? Are you strengthening? Is the plans you have strengthening your relationship, or another person's relationship with them in that process. Said, are you taking credit for all that you do? And then are you in just conversations with God before and during your planning or whatever? Proverbs 3. Sort of end on this note. Proverbs 3 says, talks about trusting in the Lord, starting at verse. And we could read the whole thing, but I don't believe it's necessary. But we're talking about trusting in the Lord, starting at verse 5. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not depend on your own understanding. Seek his will in all you do, and he will show you which path to take. Don't be impressed with your own wisdom. Instead, fear the Lord and turn away from evil. So I'll end on that note, and I'll end on a sort of challenge for you, I guess, which I liked. It's not my own challenge, admittedly, but I liked it. Like, imagine you were going to die today. Imagine you're like on your deathbed, and you have to like take an accountance for your life up to this point and where you are. How have your plans? How has your plans and what you've accomplished pleased God up to this day today? Evaluate the goals you've set up and the things you're doing in life, or the things you're striving for. Are they meant to please God and his kingdom, or are they seeking to further yourself and secure yourself, your future and whatnot? And then how have you been humbled by God in the process? You know, I talked about me and just this week and with planning my sermon. It was an interesting experience, and one I'm sure I'll face again. And how do you respond to those moments when you have these plans and you think that they're in line with God and you think you're doing right by him, but he still seems to shut one door or whatever? How do you respond to that? Are you persistent in that plan, or do you have a recognition that God has something bigger than that? You know, I talked about James and the IRS, but Wendy's here. So how do you respond to those moments when you have plans and you think that they're even in line with God, and what do you do from there? So, yeah, discuss these things, guys. Thank you.